to discuss this topic now. And so now we are going to listen the information about how the attempts to export the money gained here in Ukraine illicitly
the person will be waiting for some unfavorable conditions. It is good if there are some prepared conditions there. Secondly, the money stolen are to be invested into something, and it's good to invest classically into real estate, because this asset is getting more expensive, especially in such countries as the UK. That is why many of our journalist investigations are based on the fact that the authors follow corrupt money abroad. We find some villas, apartments, penthouses in the best parts of the world, which are registered for some in the name of some famous politicians and oligarchs, but not directly, and that makes our search more complicated. When we are talking about oligarchs, it's clear the problem is that the origin of their capital is not um, examined when they buy something abroad, and this money could be earned in the result of some corrupt actions, could be of illegal origin, but that's not checked abroad. As to politicians and civil servants, it's clear official income would be not enough for them to buy such an asset. Some examples related to the UK. The most famous assets in London. That's Akhmetov's penthouse, and that's owned by Ukrainian oligarch. The most expensive apartment which was ever sold in Great Britain, maybe you know already, that's the house which is owned by Viktor Pinchuk in Britain. People know well about the origin of his capitals, but it's those who examined this, journalists, authors of books. That is also Pinchuk's real estate. Oliver will tell more about that. One of the most interesting places in London, that is the underground station which was bought by Firtash, Ukrainian oligarch. Maybe you will tell us what Ukrainian oligarch did with it. He bought it when he was under the home arrest and he could not leave the territory of Austria. But nevertheless, British authorities, and before that, this asset was in state property, in state ownership, and but it was sold, and Firtash gas oligarch bought it. And that's what it looked like many years ago. Now he probably is planning to construct some apartments there. And you can see the whole little park is bought by Ukrainian oligarch. All of these assets are owned by Dmytro Firtash. That's the whole Ukrainian part of London. In the Western world, people understand that they themselves allow grey or black money enter their money, and their laws allow to launder such money. In Britain, there are journalists and some organizations like Transparency International. Rachel Davis is with us, and I was part of that lobbyist company, lobbyist campaign, and that started in 2015 when British documentalist, director, journalist, investigator came to me, and his idea was to make material about some companies which help foreigners to invest dirty money into real estate. And they requested me to act undercover. Maybe you heard what was our cover. I will show you some trailer. This documentary was made for British audience, but we showed it in Ukraine, and it had some impact here. And the director of this film said that he did not expect to see such a result. He made a crash test of 5 most prestigious real estate companies in London, and they all failed this test. They all agreed to help corruptionist Boris when he was saying that his money is stolen from Russian budget, and they all assisted him. And in the result, the film was became very popular. And in Britain, there was a statement made by Cameron, who said that Britain is not money for dirty, not the place for dirty money. And they started active consultations with organizations who drafted amendments to the legislation. I believe that Rachel will tell about that in more detail, but before that we'll give the floor to Oliver, who can tell us about the corrupt assets of Russian and then Ukrainian oligarchs, and please tell us a few words. Good afternoon.
Okay, I can do it, yeah. That's not a real lawn, that's actually my washing machine with some money in it. Anyway, so I've always written about Russia and Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, and about corruption, obviously, because there's a lot of it. But when it wasn't here, it was when I went to Sukholuchia, Yanukovych's other house, in 2014, that I had this sudden revelation, which was, if we go to the next one, it was this. This is the ownership structure of Sukholuchia. You can see it's owned by Dom Lesnika, and then Dom Lesnika is owned by this Astute Partners Limited, and here's Astute Partners Limited in the UK registry. But why this is very funny if you're British, I mean it's awful, but why it's funny is because it's registered on Harley Street. This is the house on Harley Street where the company was registered, and Harley Street, if you're British, is a very famous street. It's one of the most famous streets in London because all the most expensive doctors probably pretty much in the world have their offices on Harley Street. If you say Harley Street to a British person, that means expensive doctors. So just the fact that Sukholuchia, actually, and Mezhyhirya, but particularly Sukholuchia, was owned on Harley Street was to me very funny. And so I went back to Britain to investigate this, and discovered that not only was Mezhyhirya and Sukholuchia registered at Harley Street, there were about 3,000 other companies registered on Harley Street, and this amazing number of frauds in all over the world, you know, in America, in Nigeria, were all tracing back to this one address. And this made me think about the role of Britain in creating and helping fraud spread in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so I started looking at corruption not as something that happens in individual countries, as we often are told to think about it, but as something that happens transnationally in sort of networks, global networks that we need to look at, not on a country level, but globally. And Britain has been doing this for a really long time, but it really took off, I think, after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can we move there? So this isn't, there was a guy called Richard who I know who is an estate agent. He's a man who sells houses. And in 1992, it was a really bad time in London to be an estate agent because there was a recession, no one was buying houses, he was really struggling in his job. And then a Russian guy came through the door. And you understand, in Britain in 1992, Russians were still like extraterrestrial beings. We didn't know what they were. And he came through the door and he wanted to buy 3 apartments. So Richard is like, great, yeah, someone wants to buy an apartment. No one's asked to buy an apartment for months. And then he came in and he just said, there you go, £200,000, 250 and £300,000 for 3 apartments. And Richard's laughing, this was so insanely expensive and ridiculous price. The Russian guy didn't even haggle. It was just like, sure, I'll pay it. And that was it. And he thought, this is funny because it's a Russian person. But actually, what was amazing about it was that this Russian guy, who sadly he can't remember the name of, it was Alexander something. Alexander was just the first of a wave of money from the former Soviet Union that came into the London property market. This was a month later. This is a story in the Independent newspaper. I thought it was quite funny because not only did the Russian oil tycoon buy the house, he also bought everything in it. And then you see at the bottom, the only things he took in when he moved into the house were 4 televisions and some shopping from Harrods. That was it. This is, the level of the money that these people suddenly had. And for London, this was absolutely extraordinary. These people were just turning up with enormous amounts of money and just spending it. And of course, no one was really asking where the money came from, because for people like Richard, the estate agent, this was absolutely brilliant. He was really struggling to make a living. And suddenly there are people who are just coming and giving him money. So obviously he doesn't really think about where it comes from. That's absolutely not what he's concerned about. So that brings us on to the next one. Can we go? So this is Mr. Firtash. I just wanted to show you that the picture that Natalia showed earlier of his palace from the outside, which cost £60 million. It's about $80 million. It's actually only half of it that you can see in the picture, because as you can see from the scan, it goes as far down as it goes up. So this is the swimming pool in the second basement there, and this is a kind of gym sport complex, and then this is his bedroom up at the top, and then this obviously wasn't big enough. So 2 years after he bought that, he bought the next door building from our Ministry of Defence. That was another £53 million for the old tube station, Brompton Road tube station. So altogether, he owned that property, which he now owns and still owns, is worth about 110, 113 million pounds. But even that was, significantly cheaper than what Akhmetov bought. Akhmetov bought the most expensive flat ever bought in London, 140 million pounds. And the most expensive house ever bought in the UK was also bought by a Russian, 136 million pounds outside London in a place called Henley-on-Thames. So these money from the former Soviet Union has totally transformed the UK and made some people extremely rich. Richard now is a very, very, very successful man. He's one of the most profitable and successful estate agents in London, specifically because he specialised in selling houses to Russians. If we go to the next slide, this is what's amazing, is this is completely not a secret. Everybody knows this. So this is just a analysis from Savills, which is a very successful news estate agency in the UK. And you can see, the top spenders are from Eastern Europe, and then very important people from China and the Pacific. And what's amazing is that we're not just selling to crooks from the former Soviet Union. We're selling to crooks, to thieves, kleptocrats from absolutely everywhere. China, Malaysia, South America. They're all coming and buying things in London. And I think my concern was, after coming to here and seeing the damage that Britain had done by registering the company that owned Sokoluchia and preventing Ukrainians seeing what their president was doing, how their president was stealing money from them, I suppose my concern was, how do you make British people care? And it's brilliant to be here with Natalia, because Natalia and Roman, who played Boris, the Russian health minister, the TV program they made was really, really important in the campaign to make British people care about the fact that our country was taking all this stolen money, because essentially for us as British people, this is brilliant. Taking all of your stolen money is really good for us. You know, it gives us jobs, it gives us, you know, a really growing economy. So it's very difficult to persuade British people to stop taking dirty money because it's, you know, basis of quite a large part of our economy. So Roman, who played Boris, the health minister, and who's a friend of mine, and some other people, we got together and we discussed how we were going to make people care about dirty money in London. And so what we came up with, what Roman in particular came up with, was the next thing, which is the kleptocracy tours. And the kleptocracy tours have been really, really good fun and very successful as a tool for persuading people of the extent and the damage that this is causing. It's modelled on, if you go to Hollywood, you can go in a bus and they will drive you around and they will say, that's Scarlett Johansson's house, you know, that was Charlie Chaplin's house, that's, you know, Roman Polanski lived there or whatever. Instead of it being film stars, we'd put people in a bus and we drive around and show where foreign kleptocrats live. So we take them, we show them Akhmetov's flat, we show them Firtash's house, we show them Shuvalov, the Russian deputy prime minister, or Nigerian governors, Chinese money. We show them all of these Gaddafi, I mean, they're endless. I mean, we have so many examples. It's more a question of getting the best example. We really like Firtash, going to Firtash's house, partly because it's amazing, it's a massive house, but also because they always call the police. So when we go to Firtash's house, you have this sort of crowd of people looking at the house, and then the police turn up and they threaten to arrest us, and that's always, it's good, like, you know, verite. And we've had an amazing, absolutely amazing media coverage. So the picture on the right with the woman shouting out the window, that's a cartoon in The Economist. The one at the top, that was from a magazine in the UK. And we've had every major TV company from around the world has been along with us, every major newspaper. And then this is an article from Roman just explaining why we do the kleptocracy tours. And they've been really, really successful because no one now in Britain can say, we didn't know. We didn't know the damage that the business we're in was doing to other people, because we've shown them. And it's been so popular and so successful and so well known that it has, you know, I think Roman and Natalia and other people involved in this, it's massive credit for changing the tone of the conversation. It's now, you know, before sort of 2014, before this sort of thing started, it was very normal for politicians to take money from oligarchs from Eastern Europe. Tony Blair, when he stopped being Prime Minister, went to work for Nazarbayev. Peter Mandelson went to work for Aliyev in Azerbaijan. There are politicians who work for Firtash. One of them took £3,000 from Firtash, which is about $5,000 to fly to Vienna. I mean, it's an insane amount of money to go and meet Firtash. This was happening all the time. And now no one does that really anymore. It's become very unfashionable to take dirty money for politicians, which is really good. And what that has meant is that the politicians who are opposed to dirty money have been able to bring up and push through some really important new laws that will make it much, much, much harder for, you know, Gaddafi or the Malaysian royal family or Bahraini royal family or whoever to steal money from their people and to buy very expensive houses in Britain. And there is but I mean, there are an enormous number of these houses in Britain. You know, tens of thousands of houses are owned by foreign crooks. And it's, you know, we're still only just beginning to try and untangle the damage that we've done over the years, but it's very good that we've started. And Rachel is going to talk about now the laws, these new laws that we have and how they're going to work and how you know, hopefully they'll mean that essentially not only will these people stop buying houses in our country, but we'll be able to take the money away from them and maybe give it back to the countries where it first came from, including you guys. So millions of pounds for all of you.
Thank you. I mean, as Oliver said, I think for many years the UK was really in denial that it was such a big part of this problem. Because the fact is, the UK, it can sometimes be tempted, people in the UK, to point the finger at other countries and say, well, corruption happens over there, but we're fine. which is laughable, because not only do we have our own problems in our domestic sectors, such as prisons, corruption in our own politics, but we are laundering the world's dirty money. And I think for many years the UK government was in denial about this, but we started to see the language change around 2014, 2015, and that's because of the great work of investigative journalists on this couch, also organisations like Global Witness and Transparency International. And it is a huge problem. So Transparency International has collected a database, information that we've scraped from lots of different sources, court documents, Paradise and Panama paper leaks, investigative journalist articles, put them all together, and we found £4.4 billion worth of UK property that is owned by those that have a high money laundering risk. So those who have corruption convictions or allegations against them, or whose house is suspiciously much more expensive than their annual salary, like Shuvalov, for example. I think the last time he declared his annual income, it was something like £112,000 a year, and he owns 2 apartments, a 5-minute walk from Parliament, which are estimated between 11 and 15 million. So he'd have to save up every penny of his salary for 100 years, not spending any of it, to be able to afford those apartments. Which asks the question, where did the money come from? Maybe a magic genie showed up and gave it to him, who knows. So we've seen some strong words from the UK government saying they're going to tackle this, but what's actually happened in practice? As was mentioned earlier, David Cameron made a strong commitment in 2015 and then again in 2016 to say that actually we're not going to let people buy UK property anonymously in secrecy anymore. He made that strong promise. That commitment has been made by the government, but we are still waiting for any legislation. So in practice, nothing has changed yet. And I think the government almost dropped it altogether last year. Thankfully, because there were organisations and journalists really putting the pressure on, they had to recommit to it, which was great. But we're still waiting for it. On the more positive side, we have seen a couple of really big changes in the law, which I think they won't fix the problem completely, but they will help us out a lot. One of those changes is unexplained wealth orders. And this is something that Transparency International was campaigning for many years. And the reason we thought unexplained wealth orders were so important was because law enforcement in the UK, the police would often come up against blockage after blockage after blockage when they would suspect that, for example, a politician, such as Yanukovych, or a former politician, had assets in London, and they would want to be able to go to court and present enough evidence to seize those assets, but find it hard to gather the evidence. So as someone on this couch actually once said, dirty money can very easily cross borders unhindered, but police cannot. And so they often rely on information from law enforcement in the origin country. Ideally, they really hope for a conviction for the person who owns the asset in the origin country. But of course, if a country is in the midst of a revolution or there is still some corruption in the government, it can take decades for a conviction to come, if ever. So the likelihood of that happening is often quite small, and I think that's part of the reason why law enforcement in the UK have seized such a small amount of property, for example, that they believe has been bought corruptly. So unexplained wealth orders, what do they do? So an unexplained wealth order is an investigative tool, and it allows law enforcement to go to someone who owns an asset far above their wealth and ask them to explain the source of their wealth. So let's pretend that Oliver is a really corrupt health minister from, name a country, I don't know. Kyrgyzstan. Oliver earns $30,000 a year, nice salary. He has just bought 2 £10 million houses in Hampstead Heath in London. He won the lottery. I mean, he doesn't have any evidence for this. But this is what he says. I mean, good for you, right? So the police in the UK will, and the citizens maybe of his home country will look at that and think, okay. So basically, an unexplained wealth order, the police can go to a high court, and if they have suspicion, they have to meet 3 tests. First of all, Oliver meets the first test. He's a politician from overseas. Woohoo! Secondly, his income is grossly smaller than the assets he's just bought. Brilliant check. And thirdly, thank you, I can't count. I did a maths degree, I can't count, it's embarrassing. Where did all that time go? Who knows? Thirdly, the asset has to be more than £50,000. 20 million, check. So they go to the High Court judge, and the High Court says, okay, you passed the 3 tests. And they go to Oliver. They're then allowed to go to Oliver and say, Oliver, hey, huge gap between what you own and what you earn. Maybe it's legitimate. Prove it.
I won the lottery.
Well, have you got evidence of that, like ticket? No evidence? Lost it? Oh, that's a shame. So no evidence then? Right, okay. Then the law enforcement can take that as evidence, the fact that he cannot explain this to court, and under a separate measure, they can then potentially seize that asset. If they believe, yeah, it's tragic and sad. Seize the asset and then hopefully return it to the people of the country, leaving Oliver very sad, but the people of Kyrgyzstan very happy, hopefully. So that's the unexplained wealth order, and it only came into force at the end of January. It's really new. So law enforcement have only served 2 so far on houses worth £22 million. I don't know if the people have responded yet. They haven't made any announcements that I've seen, so we're kind of waiting to see how this works out. I'm really hoping they're successful, because if they are, they'll give the police confidence to serve many more of these, and I'm really hoping, if the government really uses this, that we will see some properties seized. Another big change that we saw recently, literally, gosh, it was maybe a month ago, 5 weeks ago. For many years, campaigners in the UK and elsewhere as well have been campaigning for the British Overseas Territories to stop offering secret company ownership. So as many of you will know, I think after Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands is the second main vehicle for people to move money out of Ukraine and out of Russia. We have repeatedly seen through our research in the UK, the British Virgin Islands and the other UK's overseas territories being used in corruption cases to move money secretly into UK property and other assets. To give you a kind of scale of how much secret property there is in London, Transparency International did some research with Global Witness and another organisation called Who Owns England. We found 40,000 homes in London alone, where not even the UK authorities know who owns them. Nobody knows, just crazy. Of course, some of that will have been bought with legitimate money, but we know there's a high correlation between anonymous property ownership and corruption. So we did some research and looked at every single case the UK police looked at over a 10-year period, like every property they investigated. And in 75% of those cases, the people used an anonymous company, most of them in the British Virgin Islands, to move that corrupt money into the UK property market. It's also beginning, as Oliver alluded to, it's also beginning to get British people, particularly people in London, quite angry, because a lot of these properties are empty. And in London, we have a housing shortage. We did some analysis and looked at boroughs, the different parts of London that have a high percentage of anonymously owned property. We did put a map together, and I should have brought the slides, I'm really sorry. We also did a map of abnormally low electricity use in these boroughs, so where there was hardly any electricity used at all, even in winter. Maybe they were all living in those houses and they wore lots of jumpers every winter to keep warm, but I think it's probably much more likely these houses are empty, they're underused. And it's crazy when there are so many people that need houses that can't get them. We have like tens of thousands of empty houses across London. So what happened? We and other organisations and journalists as well have been campaigning for years and years and years, particularly for places like the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, to stop offering the service of saying, hey, come and open up a company here. You don't have to publicly say who you are. You can hide all your money. We were kind of fighting this, but not really believing it was going to happen because things were going in the wrong direction. So when David Cameron stepped down as Prime Minister, the language around whether the UK would eventually pressure places like the British Virgin Islands to do this, it changed, and it was kind of going backwards. But over the last 6 months, a real coalition, a real momentum started to build, and about 5 weeks ago, the British government changed the law, basically saying to the overseas territories, you have a certain time period of roughly 3 years to make these registers public, to make it public who owns these companies. If you don't do it, we'll make you do it, which is an incredible victory we didn't think was going to happen. But if they do this and they implement it well, which is critical, it could really make quite a big difference. I just want to very, very quickly just talk about a few lessons that I think I've learned from these successes, these two successes. Just three things I've learned. First of all, it's collaboration. I think, for example, journalists working with NGOs, working with parliamentarians, working with people in the legal sector, so people from lots of different sectors coming together and pushing on this campaign from different angles, and putting aside our egos. A vulnerable moment, I'm going to admit to you all, I have an ego. Sometimes it's smaller than at other times, it kind of goes crazy. There's a part of me that really likes to be the centre of attention and likes to have people think, she did that and she's great and da-da-da. But I've learned that actually when you let your ego go and you want the credit for everything, that coalitions and working in collaboration just dies. So it was really cool to see so many people coming together and regularly just putting the ego aside and saying, let's share the credit for this, or, you know, I'll even let you take the credit for that and I don't mind if I don't get any. We saw two parliamentarians and opposing parties in the UK Parliament working to try and get this amendment to the law voted in. I think that was fantastic too. I think also evidence in the form of investigative pieces on TV, evidence in the form of statistics to convince politicians was really important. And also persistence. This was a campaign that had been going on for years and years and years and years and years, and even 3 days before the law changed, I didn't have much hope it was going to happen. So it kind of, all of us, it required us just keep going, even when we didn't have a lot of hope. And also context. Our government at the moment is a minority government. They've got fewer MPs in the House of Parliament than the opposition. And I think that really helped us win this, because 3 days before the vote, there was an article in a major UK newspaper that sort of said there are 20 government MPs that are willing to vote against the government and vote for this law, and they got really scared. They got really scared that they were going to be humiliated in Parliament, and so they kind of gave way and let this law get on the books. So finally, what next? Where do we go now? These good changes are great, but there are still so many problems with the UK system. Golden visas, you know, the fact that you can buy residency in the UK, and for the first 7 years of that system, there were no money laundering checks. So £3 billion came into the UK, 3,000 people. There were no checks on the source of their wealth. And when money laundering checks were implemented into this system, the number of applications dropped off a cliff, which kind of raises some concerns. You know, you're like, that's interesting. Also, we need to see this promise from the government about more transparency over property. We need to see that actually happen. And also, we just need to make sure that these new laws are implemented well, that these registers of public company ownership the overseas territories will have, and including the UK's own register as well, they actually contain accurate information that is useful to journalists, rather than being full of incorrect information. And I think the UK government is really at a crossroads right now, because we're heading towards Brexit, and there's lots of discussion from kind of in the UK about what kind of global Britain we want to be post-Brexit. And there's a bit of a pressure for the UK to become a bit of the Wild West of the financial system, to become a bit of a buccaneer. But I hope, because I'm an optimist, I hope the UK government will choose not to take that path, and will choose to be a beacon in the financial system, or will choose to change further laws to make sure that the UK is a good and an honest place to do business, and stops being what it is at the moment, which is a safe haven for the world's dirty money.
Дякую, Рейчел. Насправді вражає, що за такий короткий час вам все ж таки вдалося досягти декількох таких вагомих досягнень.
To do so much and make great achievements. So summarizing what you said, I would highlight this success with unexplained order, and that is supposed to clear the origin of the money, and who is which authority of your government is entitled to issue these orders, and does it regard the citizens of the other countries, or is it only valid for the or applicable to the citizens of the UK, or may it concern also, for example, the Ukrainian citizens?
For an unexplained wealth order, there are 5 mentioned in the law. 2 of them you may have heard of: the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency. And actually, they are not allowed to serve the order themselves. They have to go to a High Court judge and prove to the High Court judge that there's enough evidence, and the court serves that. It can be for citizens of any country, but the asset, for it to fall within the jurisdiction of the Act, the asset has to be in the UK, so in London. Oh. Yeah, absolutely, yes. So the National Crime Agency, because there's so much secrecy over who owns property, they need tip-offs. Yes, so if you have a tip-off, they will actually absolutely want to take that. And there are details on their website of how you can call them or email them with any information you have. Please do that, because they need that initial evidence to take that to the court.
Дуже цікаво, оскільки в нашому фільмі дворічної давнини ми розповідали про статки українських олігархів, утім після того вже багато було розслідувань про статки в Лондоні.
Publish the results of our investigation about the illicitly gained revenues that were laundered also in the UK. For example, the former head of the Ukrainian tax authority, Mr. Nasirov, he could have easily become one of the, so to say, protagonists of one of the prosecutions in the UK. I don't know if you are aware of his case. Then this second statute that you called is does it regard the need to disclose the beneficiaries of the companies? Can it be applied in reverse order, so to say, to clarify the previous sources? Я не впевнена, чи я правильно зрозуміла ваше запитання. Well, does this statute...
But I didn't quite catch his name.
That was a previous
Okay.
Now it's how the offshore transparency will work.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
all those companies that already established will be
Yes.
will also have to disclose their beneficial
Yes, they
owner,
will.
or
Yes.
only new companies.
Yeah, all companies will have to disclose who really owns them, which is great news. We just need to but the key is we need to make sure that it's a system that works. It's not just a tick box exercise. We need to make sure that all the information that's submitted is verified and checked. Otherwise it'll be useless. But yeah, they'll have to do
Яка
that.
буде процедура перевірки справжності цього бенефіціарного власника, і як можна буде забезпечити гарантію, що знову не будуть використані так звані proxy persons? Тобто який механізм перевірки?
It's a very good question, because we have this problem in Britain. In Britain, we opened our company registry so everyone can search it, and you have to say who owns a company, but no one checks the information, so it's a real problem. So yes, it's one thing, one battle that we absolutely have to fight, is to make sure that the problems that we currently have in the UK aren't repeated in the overseas territories, and instead we need to sort out our own registry to make it reliable.
So, for example, at the moment in the UK register, we've found examples where they've registered the real owner as someone who has a birth date which shows they're a 1-year-old baby. It's like, yes, the owner of this company that's been around for 3 years is 1 year old. You think, no one checked that and spotted that was probably not true?
I think there's one who hasn't been born yet.
Oh, wow, okay, great, yeah.
If you spend any time on the UK company registry, there's quite some. I mean, there's a Joseph Stalin on there. I think there's a company which is owned by Gaddafi, Osama bin Laden, and Mubarak of Egypt, supposedly. So I mean, people have a lot of fun in creating companies, but it's slightly embarrassing that no one actually checks the information.
Ну і ви сказали, що не всі ваші ініціативи були вже наразі ухвалені. Які ще ваші ідеї очікують на імплементацію?
Yeah, so the other things that really need, so what are the initiatives that still need to happen? So property register, transparency, that needs to happen. We need to make sure that all the people that got a golden visa in the first 7 years that system existed, that weren't checked, get checked. We need to make sure that our own UK register of beneficial ownership, the data is checked, that it works well. We also have a crazy system of supervising anti-money laundering checks in risky sectors in the UK. I want to give a comparison. In Spain, they have one supervisory body that checks and makes sure that all the anti-money laundering checks for estate agents, in the financial sector and the legal sector, they're done properly. In the UK, we have 25. 13 of those are for the accountancy sector alone. It's just so fragmented and inconsistent. There's so little information about what's enforced. You have some of these bodies that are meant to be regulating sectors such as the legal sector, checking they're doing anti-money laundering checks, that are both the regulator and the representative body for the sector. So think about that. They receive money and payment from firms. They're meant to be regulating and fining. It's a huge conflict of interest.
One of the registered anti-money laundering bodies is the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. So it's like if you imagine the sort of Patriarch of Kiev was the registered anti-money laundering body in the Ukraine. It's totally insane.
Yeah, we also have a system where what we call company formation agents, so people who can form companies at Companies House on behalf of other people. You don't actually have to be regulated in the UK to form these companies. So you can be based in Portugal, for example, forming these companies in the UK, which means, again, your activities are not being regulated. So that there are lots and lots of different problems that still need to be addressed, unfortunately.
Я колись брала інтерв'ю у британського парламентаря, і вона говорила про цю ж саму проблему, але дуже сильно обережно добираючи слів. Наскільки я розумію, в британській політиці є серед політиків ось такий острах, що вони будуть засуджені, коли вони викривають, значить, оборудки, там, людей, чиї гроші, значить, опиняються в британській економіці, брудні. Але при цьому в мене склалося враження, що
the wrongdoings in this area of money laundering, the cases of money laundering, and my impression was that they somehow are impeded by that fear. So are there any agents in the UK, any organizations that might be described as the intermediaries for, you know,
So your question is, why are some politicians afraid to speak out? Is that right? And
так,
yeah.
і також чи корумпують британських політиків українські, російські корупціонери?
Oh, okay.
So-called Western enablers who make it possible.
Oh, yeah.
Is this problem still on?
Yeah, we have a problem of reputation laundering, is what we call it in the UK. So we have some MPs that are very willing to speak out and be bold, and we have others who we suspect are almost helping corrupt people launder their reputations, so improving their reputations by being associated with them, serving on all-party groups that potentially receive money from questionable sources. That's definitely a problem. I mean, unfortunately, we have a wider problem even beyond money laundering, where, you know, at Transparency International, we also believe there's actual corruption within our UK Parliament to some extent, and there's huge complacency in our Parliament about whether there's even a problem. And we're working at the moment to try and raise this issue of reputation laundering and raise the fact that Parliament has a problem as well of associating with certain people and therefore helping them. We're struggling to get lots of people to put forward our views. We've found a few, but it's tough to get the politicians to challenge their own institution and to challenge their colleagues.
Можливо, є запитання? Так, будь ласка.
Так як ми розуміємо, в кожному антикорупційному законодавстві є такі поняття.
In British legislation, as in the legislation of many countries, there is a notion of the revenues that have dubious origin, to say the least. In Ukraine, for example, in our legal system, we have a number of legal acts, the acts that have already been adopted, but that do not contain clear-cut definitions of ill-gained money. What are the, the real parameters to define them? Do you have in your law this definition of of what we call, as the journalists, the dirty money, and what would be your?
Sure. So if we're talking about, let's take, for example, the unexplained wealth orders. It's defined as two parts to it. So it's either defined as money that has come through bribery and corruption. So either a politician has stolen the money from their own budgets, or, for example, they received a bribe from someone to pass a law and they're trying to get that money out of the country. The other part of it is if it relates to serious crime, as defined by what's called the Serious Crime Act in the UK. And the Serious Crime Act has, so dirty money, it has like a list of crimes, child prostitution, drug trafficking, people trafficking. The list kind of goes on. So any money that's related to that criminal activity is also seen as dirty money. Does that make sense?
Дуже дякую за презентацію, дуже цікаво почути.
Interesting to hear. I have a question. There's a joke in Ukraine. What's the difference between old prosecutor and young prosecutor? The old prosecutor, the young prosecutor registers all for his grandmother, and the old prosecutor for his granddaughter. When our former prosecutor general goes to London, buys a house for £50 million and registers it in the name of his grandmother or granddaughter, depending on whether he's young or old. Can we, Ukrainian journalists, investigators, can we follow that in the result of all the changes in your legislation? Everyone says that Magnitsky and his family have property in London, but we failed to find it. That's a good question. Will these new pieces of legislation help that?
The big problem, certainly when I speak to British investigators and who work in this area, when it comes to working with Ukrainians, they find it very difficult to get evidence from Ukraine that is strong enough to satisfy a British judge. You probably remember the case of Mykola Zlochevsky that they talked about earlier this morning. There was a case in London when a British court froze $23.5 million of his, and then when the Serious Fraud Office tried to take that case onwards, the Ukrainian prosecutor's office provided a letter to Zlochevsky saying that he hadn't committed any crimes. So the Serious Fraud Office thought that they were working with the prosecutor's office, but actually the Ukrainian prosecutor's office destroyed the case. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. Sakhvarelidze said that they did that because they took a bribe, but we don't actually know whether that's true or not. But it was a very unfortunate event because essentially the Serious Fraud Office only really has time to do 7 or 8 big cases at any one time. And they'd spent 6 months working on that case, and then it was destroyed. So it makes them much less likely to want to do a Ukrainian case again because there is so much corruption. They can do Nigerian cases, Malaysian cases, Brazilian cases, Russian cases, where Argentinian cases, Antarctican cases probably. That essentially has made it very difficult to persuade anyone to be interested in Ukraine because of what happened to the Zlochevsky case. So it's very important if there is evidence of wrongdoing, particularly if there's a connection to the UK, to try and pressure the prosecutors here to do a better job because it was a great. I mean, actually, some British politicians had put quite a lot of effort into that case, the Zlochevsky case, and the fact that it collapsed was very unfortunate and really set back the cause of trying to help Ukraine.
Так, але ми знову бачимо форум Злочевського в Монако, на який приїжджають перші особи.
Microphone, please, microphone. Please speak into the microphone. Ask to speak into the mic. I would like to clarify practically. A lot of assets in Britain are registered not directly, but not in name of the corruptionists or their relatives. Usually that's registered in the name of the company, and that's some offshore company from BVI. How this new Transparency Act will work, and we journalists are interested whether all those who are willing, all journalists will have access to this information, or only law enforcement bodies.
Available to everybody or just to law enforcement?
It would be for everyone. It'll be online.
When?
It will have to be by 2021, 2020.
Yeah, so they'll have to start moving to do it in 2020, so it'll be up by 2021 or 2022.
So we have a very peculiar constitutional system whereby the overseas territories are British colonies. So our parliament, the British Parliament, can make laws for them if it wants to, but it doesn't do that because it thinks that's rude. So they have their own parliaments which make their own laws, and normally that's what happens. Their own parliaments make their laws, but in this case, it's actually quite controversial. The British Parliament has passed a law for the overseas territories, and it's made them very angry that this has happened. But there isn't anything they can do about it. They're colonies, so they have to go along with it, which means that in 3 years' time they have to be open, and then you'll be able to search these. It'd be, look at them like Google.
Long time to wait still.
I would like to ask a question about so-called law firms. There are a lot of them that help Russian businessmen to register their own property or firms, and they're usually owned by Russians, and this has the same name of director. So it's basically, you can see that this is made for fraud. Does NCA look closer now for this type of law firms or not?
I'm worried that they're not looking closely enough. So there's this thing in I don't know a lot about law, so maybe this is something that happens in every country, but certainly in the UK, a lawyer can cite legal privilege, which means any communications between a lawyer and their client, health minister, does not have to be disclosed in court. And there was a test case, when was it? Maybe 2005, relating to this, and basically it set a precedent for saying that lawyers did not have to report this information. There was an 87% drop in reports to the National Crime Agency from the legal sector after that happened, which indicates there's a lot that's being noticed by lawyers in their communication with clients. So sometimes they are maybe fully complicit, helping launder money. Other times they may be working with a client and they see something that looks a bit suspicious, which they should report, but because they don't have to under law, they don't. And it's a huge problem for us. I mean, they're essentially helping to facilitate this money, or those that are complicit through London. We call them professional enablers. We do believe that law enforcement in the UK needs to take a much closer look, but they are slightly constrained by the law in terms of prosecuting individuals as well in the UK. So there's more that needs to be done on the legal side as well, I think, before law enforcement will even have the full powers to act.
Так, хто ще не став? Будь ласка.
Great panel, and question to Oliver and Rachel. In terms of reputation laundering with the two Ukrainian oligarchs, Akhmetov and Firtash, can you give a clean example? I guess Firtash would be the Cambridge University donations, or
I'm not
incorrect?
sure. Akhmetov hasn't really been involved in reputation laundering in the UK very much. He isn't very well known. Firtash is like the textbook example of reputation laundering. He arrived in the UK in 2007 after he made a lot of money when the new big deal that came in here, the gas procurement deal in 2006. He arrived in the UK in 2007. He created a charitable foundation, the British Ukrainian Society, and he has some quite well-known politicians joined the board of that. So 2 members of the House of Lords and 1 member of the House of Commons. What was interesting is they came from all 3 main parties. One was Labour, one was a Conservative, and one was a Liberal. So this wasn't, he was very clever in who he attracted to do that. He gave a lot of money to Cambridge University, which meant he got to meet the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, and was made a member of the Guild of Benefactors of Cambridge University, which is, a very prestigious role. And then he bought his house in Cottage Place, the one with the swimming pool in the second basement. And then he bought the tube station in 2014, just before the revolution here. So yeah, he essentially managed to infiltrate very quickly the British establishment. And that was really he was very clever in associating himself with high-profile politicians, and then also with giving money to one of our major universities. So essentially, he made himself look like a benefactor, and no one really asked where the money came from. No one really cared. It was only after the revolution and after he was arrested in Vienna that there began to be a scandal about this. Before that, no one even talked about it. But as for Akhmetov, I don't think Akhmetov he's kept a very low profile, and the same is true for Pinchuk. Neither of them has really advertised themselves at all. And Zlochevsky, though, has been much more prominent in Monaco. He's created this forum that Natalia mentioned. When the prince, is it a prince of Monaco or duke or whatever they have there? He's a good friend apparently. And then you get the Joschka Fischer, the German politician. There's that Polish, is it Kwasniewski, the Polish politician, Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, who all go and show how friendly they are with him. So he's been quite clever as well.
And what happened to those high-profile politicians who were working for Firtash for money?
Nothing. So John Whittingdale, who used to be the culture minister, he was head of what's called the parliamentary group on Ukraine, and he received money from the British Ukrainian Society, which is Firtash's foundation, for his travel expenses and everything. I had an article in the newspaper recently about this, and he was very angry because he felt that I'd been unfair, because I said it was ridiculous that it cost him £3,000 to fly to Vienna, because a ticket to Vienna is like £100. But he thought that was reasonable, £3,000, anyone could spend that. So yeah, I mean, it's nothing has happened, but it's embarrassing for them now, so at least there's that.
And what's the reaction of the society of such stories?
I mean, it's bad, it's negative, obviously. People don't like the fact that it's happening. So yeah, I mean, less people do this. I mean, there used to be from Azerbaijan, a very similar group called the European Azerbaijan Society, which was created by a guy called Talay Haydarov, whose father, Kamaluddin Haydarov, is the emergencies minister in Baku. And they had a lot of members of parliament going to Baku, having fun, going to parties, and like really a lot of people. But that's stopped now, so that doesn't happen anymore. So I mean, there is progress, but only from a very low base.
Чи є ще запитання? Хто ще не ставив запитання?
I was listening to your stories about courts. I understand criminal or anti-corruption court. And you said the judges are not very willing to take this or that case related to Ukraine because there were so many things. So I'm sorry. But now with Ukrainian courts, there are cases, we have automatic distribution, we have the system, but in the courts of your country, is it not like that? Is it not written how it should be? We understand that it's not about candy. I like this, I want to take this, I don't want to take that. Is there any procedure in your court which does not, which gives these courts some anti-corruption cases.
Whether the courts accept the cases, the problem is in what police officers choose to investigate, because the primary intention of police officers is to secure a conviction. And the problem has happened repeatedly in court cases related to specifically, actually not only, but mainly former Soviet countries, so not just Ukraine, also has happened with Kyrgyzstan and with Russia, that high-profile defendants, famously Maxim Bakiev, the son of the former president of Kyrgyzstan, have argued that the proceedings are, Boris Berezovsky as well, very famously, have argued that proceedings are politically motivated against them. And so they argue that the evidence that's coming from their home country should not be taken, should not be accepted by the court, and they've tended to be successful in arguing that. And it's part of the problem when, if you can argue that a legal system is corrupted, as people argue about Ukraine or Russia, if evidence from that legal system comes to the UK, lawyers for the defendant, so lawyers for Bakiev or Berezovsky or whoever, can argue very successfully that that evidence should not be accepted. And it's a real problem because essentially it means that any evidence of their crime can essentially be discounted. And without evidence of a crime, you can't convict someone of money laundering. Because money laundering is a secondary offence. There has to be a crime first, and then you launder the money. And so it makes it very, very difficult to get any conviction in. I mean, and this isn't just a Ukrainian problem. I speak to prosecutors and investigators. Essentially, at the moment in Nigeria, there is a whole team of British investigators working in Nigeria for the Nigerian government, trying to find evidence that is good enough to satisfy a British court. The same in Spain. But anywhere essentially that doesn't have that, the evidence will be not accepted by a British court. So it makes it incredibly difficult to get a conviction, which is why the police don't bother investigating, because they have only a certain amount of money, and if they're going to focus on cases where they will get a conviction. And if they can get a conviction from a Nigerian case, they'll focus on a Nigerian case and not on a Ukrainian case. So it makes it very difficult, which is why, though, the unexplained wealth orders are so interesting and so important, because that totally changes the dynamic and the calculations. It means that from now on, whoever, Boris Berezovsky or Bakiev or whoever, would have to bring evidence to a court that would satisfy the court, rather than the court having to essentially accept evidence from the prosecution. So it's a new and exciting world that we have with this, but it's very new and we don't know how it will work yet.
Я хотів уточнення просто. Ми розуміємо, що справи
Are there, but the law enforcement body, we call it pre-judicial investigation. Pre-judicial investigation finishes with accusation and the case is transferred to the court. I would like to clarify, when the case gets to the court, it's registered there, then how is it distributed? Because I understood that the judges can select that this case, they take this case or not, or they do not take this case. It's not the judge who decides whether this case is prospective or not. The evidence was collected. The case is in the court. What happens next? Can your judges select or they don't? On us?
Yours, in Ukraine, prosecutors are very powerful, and prosecutors decide when to open a criminal case and when that should be investigated. And prosecutors have very strong powers in that regard. In Britain, the police make that decision, what to investigate, and they then, once they've investigated a crime, they pass their documents to the prosecutors, and the prosecutors then look at what the police have collected and then decide whether they should take that forward to a court. Then separately, if there is evidence from another country, whether that's Ukraine or Nigeria or Malaysia or wherever, that evidence, before they ask for cooperation, they have to ask our Interior Ministry, and then that Interior Ministry has to ask the other country's Interior Ministry, then that Interior Ministry has to ask that country's prosecutors. At every single one of those stages, the people can say, no, there's no point doing this. So you have to jump through, you have to go through 6 or 7 stages sometimes before you start getting evidence. And then that's before you know whether that evidence is any good. And the problem is, if you are dealing with an interior ministry in a country that is known to be corrupt, you are only going to get evidence if it is against someone who is the political enemy of that country. That's the argument. So it makes it very difficult to trust or believe in evidence that comes from a country, like in the case of Bakiyev from Kyrgyzstan, because everyone knows that Maxim Bakiyev is the political enemy of the current government of Kyrgyzstan. He's also a crook and a thief, but that doesn't alter the fact that he's their political enemy, which means his lawyers can say this is all made up and invented, and actually it's very difficult for prosecutors in the UK to argue against that. That's what I mean. So this isn't, it isn't, they would love to prosecute, you know, they'd love to take a Firtash to court, for example, I'm sure, but they're never going to be able to get evidence that they can rely on from a Ukrainian court. That's the problem.
Дякую.
Чи будуть ще якісь запитання? Насправді, Великобританія
Great Britain is moving along the changes which will potentially help to fight the income of dirty money. And it would be great if
And it would be wonderful if Britain's case would be taken as an example by the other countries who do not have similar initiatives, like, for example, in the US, where they, in my view, only are starting to understand that they also need to strengthen their transparency laws and improve their legislation to that end. So they can look at your success story in this struggle against corruption as a good example, as an inspiration for themselves. So thank you very much, and thank you for your very positive contribution for the economies of the countries like ours. Ми не чуємо, що кажуть, перекладачі не чують без мікрофону. We cannot hear without microphone. Can I join? May I join, rather, the discussion? My name is Olga Simonovich, and I'm a regional editor of the global network of investigative journalists. In case you have been interested in journalist investigations, you might have already seen our joint project of the Institute of the Development of Mass Media and of our network of journalist investigation. You can register yourself or sign yourself up to that internet portal where there is information about this work, and by doing so you will be able to contact investigative journalists and experts from all over the world. From them you would be able to get advice and information that you might need. JJ.org is our website, and the site is now being translated into a number of languages. So let me inform you about our network and what are the advice that we generate and how you can use it. We do not have it yet in Ukrainian, but we are trying to, first of all, address the largest audiences of the countries that most need that. For example, the African countries, and as our team is very small, we only have 10 people, we are not able to make our site, to translate our site into all languages that the people might need.